So I'm going to speak in English so that Professor Wachtel can also understand what I'm saying. We just had two very intense sessions that were really very important, and I think they also reflect some of Yoel's own intensity as well. And anyone who knows him and has worked with him knows that what everyone else brought, Yoel also brings to all of his meetings and all of his work as well. And we're now on our third panel, or third session, and really we're talking about trying to start to integrate different parts of Yoel in different ways. We're going to hear, after Dr. Wachtel, we'll hear from a number of Yoel's students. And of course, it would have been nice had we been able to hear from another one of Yoel's colleagues, mentors, Minuchin, who is really one of the fathers of family therapy, but we can't really think of a better substitute in terms of another figure who really, one could say, is the father of integrative therapy in so many ways. Dr. Paul Wachtel, who for 50 years has been writing about psychotherapy integration, that dynamic and CBT and systems therapies do not have to be seen as separate schools in conflict, if we try to compare this to our last session, but instead can arrive at an integration and can really inform one another and assist one another improve our patients' lives, which is really what therapy is all about. And you're here to hear him and not me, and so without further ado, Professor Paul Wachtel.
I wish I could be there in person, but this will have to be the next best option. In part, what I'll be talking about today is the field of psychotherapy and overcoming the wars between orientations. And in part, I'll be talking about the work of Yoel Elisor, as is appropriate today. And apropos Minuchin, I thought that one actual illustration of how the two focuses of my talk, the psychotherapy integration and the work of Yoel, overlap, is illustrated in a quote from Minuchin and Nichols, with which Yoel begins one of his papers, and you'll, I think, see the relevance very clearly. The quote goes as follows. There is a song that needs to be sung in our culture, a song of relationships, a song of people enriching and expanding each other. We are born with the capacity for collaboration, accommodation, and mutuality, but this collaborative process needs highlighting in our culture because what we usually notice are differences and discord. I thought that quote from Minuchin, but cited by Yoel, seemed like a very good place to look at the intersections I'm going to be looking at today. Because highlighting differences and highlighting discord is sadly a very dominant note in the world these days. It's true in your country, it's true in my country, and it's true in much of the world. And it's true also in the world of psychotherapy. In the world of psychotherapy, we largely live in silos. We look at people from other orientations through often very negative prism or filter. We bolster our own point of view by citing evidence that our approach works, whatever our approach might be. And usually that involves comparing one's favorite approach to so-called treatment as usual. And all I can say is, thank God that treatment as usual is actually not very usual, because treatment as usual is chosen to be as inept as possible in order to make one's own point of view look good by comparison. So each approach has lots of evidence that it works, but there's rather little evidence that one's favorite approach works better than anyone else's favorite approach. And that gets largely swept aside or by very kind of subtle philosophical twists and turns, trying to tease out something that shows, well, really mine is better. But the vast majority of the studies really do not show differences. But nonetheless, these wars, these conflicts, these my approach is better than yours persist. And what also persists and is just as problematic is my approach is different from yours. There's a tremendous emphasis, overemphasis really, on the differences between approaches. And that's part of what I want to raise some question about this morning, or I think where you are, it's this afternoon. Advocates of different approaches operate from different silos. Most therapists pay relatively little attention to work that goes on outside of the organizations they belong to, the approach they identify with, the journals they read, the meetings they attend. We each constitute, in a sense, what we call different theoretical orientations, operate almost more like different ethnicities, that we are culturally different and we think the others speak a funny way of talking. We don't really see or listen, and especially see the affinities, see the ways they go together. Now, there are certainly exceptions to this. Most people in our field do pay at least lip service to ideas of integration and certainly to openness. And most training programs do include at least some representatives of a range of viewpoints, but it's not very hard for anybody in the know to identify for most training programs what's the theoretical orientation of that program. My sense is there are few truly integrative training programs. And if any of you in the audience are part of a truly integrative training program, not only am I delighted, but I invite you to contact me because I would like to know about truly integrative programs. There are some, and there are some organizations. For example, SEPI, the Society for the Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, is an organization that has been around now for almost 40 years. It's actually an organization in which Israel is one of the leading countries in terms of providing leadership and inspiring examples. So SEPI is an exception, and I get to see work of a very, very diverse sort when I go to SEPI meetings, but it's relatively unusual. And of course, Yoel is another exception, because he brings to bear, when he presents a systems point of view, for him, as I understand it, systems thinking is not another school of thought in battle with psychodynamic or cognitive behavioral or humanistic experiential. It's a way of thinking that brings things together. It aims to see people in context and in relationship. And in that sense, it cuts across the wars between orientations, cuts across boundaries, and sees connections. Doesn't stay in a silo. It's not about a systems silo. Certainly in Yoel's hands. So that, for example, as I am sure you've been hearing in this conference, his work illuminates not just therapy from a systems perspective, but he looks at the larger systems of delivery of mental health services altogether, at the organization of society and how that affects mental health. And even apropos the title of my talk, Beyond the Wars Between Orientations, Yoel looks at the reality of real warfare and studies the behavior and the experience of soldiers. So this kind of breadth on Yoel's part is not only admirable, but it's very, very relevant to the topic I want to discuss today, which is how to overcome the warfare, the divisions that characterize and limit our thinking. And in doing so, I think what we need to do is to really understand human beings in context, human beings in action, human beings as we live in the world, not just as we live in our heads. So we need to look at people in context, at our actions, at the reactions of others to us, and how the reactions of others to us are perceived by us, lead us to behave again in certain ways, lead others to perceive us in certain ways, which leaves us perceiving them. How this all fits together, this is much of what being systemic involves, but especially being systemic in a way that overlaps with, integrates with, synthesizes the range of views in our field. What for me helps to pull together all of these various elements is looking at how each facet of the person that may be highlighted by a particular point of view, the thoughts, assumptions, schemas that cognitive therapists emphasize, the impulses and defenses and conflicts and internalized objects that psychodynamic therapists emphasize, the unaccepted affects that experiential therapists emphasize, how all that, the behavior that, I was going to say old-fashioned. I don't think they're old-fashioned anymore, but since cognitive behavior therapy has arisen, there were relatively few people who just call themselves behavior therapists. But behavior therapy still looks at our actions in the world, how all of those fit together is patterned in circles by and large, in circular patterns where each facet recreates the other facets, and that becomes part of how it all fits together. These self-replicating feedback loops, which is the primary task of a psychotherapist to modify. Let me give a couple of examples so that I'm not just leaving this as an abstract idea. Take somebody who is conflicted over aggression. We can think about this in psychodynamic terms. We can think of this in terms of assertiveness from a more behavioral point of view. We can think of it from a number of ways. But if you have learned that being assertive, and especially being angry, even if there's good reason to be, is dangerous, what you are likely to do is to hold that back. From a psychodynamic point of view, for example, we might talk about reaction formation. A person tries so hard not to be angry, not even to let themselves know they're angry, that they go out of their way to be excessively kind and nice and cooperative. Behavior that, when it's not exaggerated, clearly is a good thing and makes our own life and the life of other people better. But when it is so exaggerated because it's a defense against being a different way, there's an irony that's very likely to occur. That is part of how these vicious circles work. If I am so eager, without even being aware of what I'm doing, to not be assertive, to not be angry, to not dominate, to not push what I want, I end up getting much less of life's good things than somebody who was able to be normally or healthily assertive. And when I don't get what I want, what I need, at some level, what's going to happen is it's going to make me angry. When I see everybody else getting what I'm not getting, it doesn't feel good. I get angry. But when anger is stirred in me, remember how this started, or at least how the description started. When anger is stirred in me, it makes me really uncomfortable. So I push it away, again, mostly without awareness. And the very deprivations that are feeding the anger are also the product of the anger, and it keeps feeding the anger, and then the anger gets suppressed, and then we get less, and then we get more angry, and then we push it back, and it keeps repeating itself. Or let's say somebody has conflicts over sexual feelings or the wish for intimacy. If that's the case, we are likely to be not very good at expressing that. Doesn't totally disappear for most people because it's a powerful part of being a person, but we express sexuality or even just the wish for intimacy in a kind of an awkward way because we have been anxious about it, and the feelings we're anxious about get disrupted. So our expressions of sexual interest or our expressions of a wish for intimacy are likely to not receive a positive response from others because they're awkward, because and it could be overly suppressed, it could be overly aggressive and not refined because you're sort of doing it almost without looking. And the result is a response from others that makes the wish for sexual experience, the sexual wishes or the wishes for intimacy, still more dangerous because they have met with problematic responses. And then when they are still more dangerous, as they're expressed again, they again get a negative response, and it too just keeps replicating itself. So in all sorts of ways, for almost every important human need, human emotion, when we're conflicted about it, when we suppress it, when we don't learn to integrate it into our daily life, it creates consequences that maintain the anxiety, that lead us once again to act ineffectively, which again get a response from others that's problematic, and it becomes self-perpetuating. So this is one of the reasons why in dealing with this, we need to understand that all of the facets that different therapies talk about all come into play. We need to look at the unconscious fantasies and conflicts. We need to look at the cognitions that distort. We need to look at the way the behavior is expressed. We need to look at what we might call the reinforcement contingencies. We need to look at the contexts in which it's manifested. In all of these ways, we need to find as many ways to intervene as possible, because part of the problem is if you work on one part of it and don't see the larger context, good work in the therapy session can actually be undermined by the way people are living their life in their larger context. For example, psychodynamic therapists often feel what's really important is, and I can get at things in a very intensely subjective way by working in the transference. And you may be able in the session to create circumstances where the person really has new experiences, really learns to be different, to accept the parts of themselves they've pushed away. But if you're not paying attention to how they're living their life in the larger context, part of what I think happens very often, part of why you may often find to have the experience of somebody you know tells you how wonderful their therapist is because they're having such a great experience and they are actually changing in the room. But you look at their life and their life is still screwed up. Why is that? Because we learn to discriminate. We learn in the therapy room, it's safe to feel this. But in my outside life, it isn't. Because if you haven't worked on helping the person to practice doing it differently in the outside life, to perceiving things more clearly in the outside life, there becomes a kind of a distinction made on the patient's part, again, unconsciously, unwittingly. It's safe in here, it's not safe in there, and that gets replicated. So attending to all of these dimensions is absolutely crucial. Now, obviously, we're on a time schedule here, and I can't even begin to illustrate further some of this. So I just want to end by highlighting again the qualities in Yoel that I started by talking about, and how that bears on what I've been talking about so far. We might wonder what would cognitive therapy have looked like, for example, if Aaron Beck, instead of studying 10 years intensively ego psychology, which has cast a large shadow over cognitive therapy, had studied with relational analysts instead, or even better, had studied with Salvador Minuchin? What would cognitive therapy look like? It would probably look a lot like what I suspect Yoel's work looks like. Yoel takes us outside of the silos. Systems for him is not another brand of therapy. I don't think there are any acronyms in our field associated with Yoel, and that's a good thing. Our field has too many acronyms. But what Yoel highlights in the breadth of his work is how all the different parts fit together. They're not in competition, they fit together. And that's a lesson important for us to learn. And it's the reason that I am especially happy to have been invited to be here as part of the celebration of a man for whom that lesson is so central. So I will stop here and let the conference proceed. I wish I could be there.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. Your presentation of me is much better than I could present myself. So it's good. It's on tape now. I can use it. Be well. I appreciate your contribution to this conference very, very much. And I'm going forward. We are right on time.